You are the man who gave them the power to destroy themselves. And the world is not prepared.
Christopher Nolan has been my favorite director for over 15 years. With the initial 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 punch of Memento, Insomnia, Batman Begins, The Prestige, and The Dark Knight. I remember seeing the trailers for Batman Begins as a kid and being so excited, thinking, the guy who made Insomnia is making a Batman movie? Don't even get me started on Insomnia. I could talk about how amazing that movie is for hours. Okay, very briefly, Insomnia is a criminally overlooked film from Nolan's filmography, with incredible performances from Al Pacino and Robin Williams, and I can't recommend it enough. I've had some of the best cinematic experiences of my life with Nolan's films. Like, I'll never forget the feeling of seeing The Dark Knight in 70mm IMAX for the first time. In the opening shot, when the tiny logos expand into the vast skyline of Gotham, filling the entire 10-story IMAX screen, I remember feeling like I was literally gonna fall out of my seat. From that moment, I was hooked. Nolan was the first filmmaker to use IMAX cameras in a feature film. Since then, I've made it a point to see every single film shot with IMAX film cameras on an IMAX screen. Seeing Interstellar on a dome IMAX screen was the stuff of legend. In a dome IMAX screen, the screen wraps around you and goes far above your head, and the seats are all positioned tilting upwards. Experiencing those scenes while Cooper is floating in the Tesseract in that environment is something I'll remember forever. Nolan is passionate about the cinema experience for the audience, which sadly in today's world is undoubtedly a dying concern. He shoots on film, hardly uses any CGI, opting to capture almost everything in camera, and insists his movies have the option to be projected on film. This stands in stark contrast to the studio model of shoot on digital, make everything CGI, and make the movie available for streaming as soon as possible. Nolan's preoccupation is preserving a true cinematic experience, and I hope that passion never dies. Oppenheimer is a biopic that tells the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist who, during World War II, led the Manhattan Project, which resulted in the creation of the atomic bomb. With Oppenheimer, Nolan went back to his roots of his films Following and Memento, incorporating black and white into the narrative. Only here, it's used as a tool to differentiate the objective reality of events as they occurred versus the subjective prism through Oppenheimer himself. I thought the black and white scenes did wonders in communicating a raw, documentary-like style to the film. I thought the non-linear editing was also a good way to highlight these contrasts, breaking up not only the timeline of the film, but the perspectives as well. The dichotomy of black and white and color is a fascinating idea, but I was hoping that this would be utilized a bit more so the audience can gain even more insight into the truth versus the perceived truth, by showing the audience parts of the same events or conversations from two completely different perspectives, one factual and one through Oppenheimer's perspective. While we get the occasional glimmer of this, particularly the scene where Robert is ambushed by Strauss, I couldn't help thinking that there was a lot more to say here when it comes to memory versus truth. Since the scenes in color are entirely from Oppenheimer's perspective, he could easily be misremembering or disregarding certain details, and that could have been emphasized by revisiting more key scenes from a factual perspective. The performances in the film are top-notch, headlined by a career-defining performance from Cillian Murphy. His turn as Oppenheimer was outstanding, and he disappeared completely into the role. Other standouts include Emily Blunt, Benny Safdie, David Krumholtz, and Robert Downey Jr. Overall, I was shocked by the sheer amount of talent in this film. There must have been 20 A-list actors, some of them only showing up for less than 2 minutes. Many of them appearing briefly throughout the film in the background, shown so little that you'd barely know they were there. This adds to the realism of the documentary style of filmmaking that Nolan is emulating here. Interestingly, this occurs not just in the objective scenes, but in the subjective scenes as well, suggesting visually that Oppenheimer's focus on these people is small to virtually non-existent. I would say the only performance in the film that I found unimpressive was Matt Damon's, who I found to be rather one-dimensional and somewhat bland. Christopher Nolan's films are unforgettable, thanks in large part to their emotional and epic scores, with his movies boasting some of the best music ever put to film. I was highly anticipating the score for Oppenheimer, and I'm pleased to say that the score by Ludwig Göransson is phenomenal. It gives the film an immediacy and propulsion that's hard to put into words. At times operatic, and other times intimate and restrained, Ludwig's work is extraordinary, immersing the audience fully into Oppenheimer's brain. It truly might be the best score so far this decade. Just as incredible as the score is the cinematography, which benefits from Nolan's decision to film with both 65mm Panavision cameras and 65mm IMAX cameras. The large-scale format works to not only emphasize the beautiful landscapes and unimaginable power of the Trinity test, but to emphasize the intimate details of Oppenheimer's face throughout the film. Through these stunning close-ups, the audience is able to gather a unique insight into Oppenheimer, fully immersed in his world and what's happening around him. Nolan's films are often dealing with surrealist ideas, but they're dealt with in an incredibly realistic way. Take Insomnia, for example. The hallucinations that Dormer has are heightened and surreal, but they are explainable as a consequence of his sleep deprivation, similar to the hallucinations that Bruce has in The Dark Knight Rises, where he's about to pass out from the immense pain he's experiencing after breaking his vertebrae. Then there's Inception, where the film's many surrealist elements only occur when a character is asleep and we're experiencing their dreams. The non-literal elements of Nolan's films are never purposeless, and are always able to be explained rationally by what's happening to the characters in the story. Oppenheimer has several surreal scenes that are visual manifestations of Robert's guilt, including seeing a naked Jean on top of him while he's revealing that he cheated on his wife, as well as witnessing a cheering crowd at Los Alamos being eviscerated by an atomic bomb. I thought these were far and away some of the most effective scenes in the film, peeling back the shell of a man who is racked with immense guilt for what he has done to those in his personal life and what he has done to the world. While I absolutely loved these scenes, I was hoping that Nolan would lean into the surrealism a bit more throughout the movie, providing an even deeper insight into the moral weight that Oppenheimer is crushed by. Something I thought that was very well done was a subtle visual emphasis on Oppenheimer's pipe and cigarettes. Even though a significant amount of people smoked in the 1940s and 1950s, only a few characters are actually seen smoking cigarettes in the film, besides Oppenheimer himself. When they're shown, it's only for the briefest of moments, helping to highlight Oppenheimer's world, which seems to be shrouded through the haze of a near constant smoke. In real life, J. Robert Oppenheimer was said by his colleagues to eventually have smoked as many as 100 cigarettes a day, which is something that he willingly sets fire and exposes himself to, even though it is inherently dangerous. The comparisons to his work are quite striking, and this increasingly neurotic compulsion could have been born out of many things, but the most compelling of those cinematically would be that it's a result of the remorse that he feels about what he brings upon the world. For roughly the past 10 years, starting with The Dark Knight Rises, the dialogue in Nolan's films, for reasons unknown, is notoriously difficult to hear clearly. I remember watching the prologue sequence from The Dark Knight Rises during an IMAX screening of Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol, and I, with no hyperbole, could understand about 5 words that Bane was saying.
No! It's the photograph of the wreckage from it. The fire rises. Get down there! Ain't got the time for fear. That comes later.
Luckily, the test screenings forced a new sound mix, and Bane's dialogue ended up being mostly understandable. Although none of Nolan's actual finished films are as extreme as that prologue experience, there are still lines of dialogue in his films that are difficult to understand. This seems to be an intentional choice. Maybe Nolan believes that this enhances the realism in his work. In real life, you wouldn't hear every word being said around you. However, with Oppenheimer being almost entirely dialogue, it can be frustrating to feel like you're missing several words or sentences in each scene, especially when the dialogue that you're missing is potentially essential to the plot. I would say the most frustrating thing about the film, however, is the editing. Not the editing between different time periods or inserts of particles and explosions. I found that to work profoundly well, actually. but how Nolan edits the majority of his dialogue scenes. There seems to constantly be quick cuts in them that feel, in large part, unmotivated, sometimes detracting from the power of the scene and what's being revealed. This editing style, like the muffled dialogue, has been prevalent in Nolan's films since about The Dark Knight Rises, but is most evident in Tenet and Oppenheimer. The example I think of when I'm trying to explain this is this quick dinner scene from Interstellar.
The dust.
Lois, I have a friend who could look at his lungs.
The edit to the kids saying the dust feels almost accidental. It happens so rapidly that the viewer hardly has time to process the information. Now, this can work in action sequences, but when it comes to dialogue scenes, it can be a bit jarring. I would say this could be explained away as another tool to explore the psyche of Oppenheimer, but Nolan has been using this style for years now, with no apparent rhyme or reason. However, in contrast to this, the choice to juxtapose Oppenheimer's reality with constant interruptions of explosions, particles, and collisions was a brilliant way to show the intensity and inescapability between Oppenheimer and the path that lies before him. The character that gives us the most insight into Oppenheimer is Jean Tatlock. It was Jean that got Robert into the poetry that eventually led him to call the first atomic bomb test Trinity. Robert promises to always be there for her no matter what. Although they ended their relationship formally in 1939, they never stopped loving each other. Described by a friend of Robert's, Jean was Robert's truest love. He loved her the most. He was devoted to her. When Robert learns of Jean's death, the idea to not definitively show what happened to Jean was another fantastic way to convey the guilt that Robert is experiencing. Not only does he feel horrible for cheating on his wife, when describing her suicide, we see flashes of a gloved hand holding Jean down in the tub, suggesting that Oppenheimer feels as though he was actually responsible for her death. Regardless of whether she killed herself or not, he wasn't there for her when she needed him, like he always promised he would be, and this haunts him for the rest of his life. Lewis Strauss spends the film entrenched in a personal vendetta against Oppenheimer, whether through sheer delusion or under the veil of jealousy that Robert had been declared the most important man who ever lived. Strauss took the moment that Einstein ignored him as he walked away from Oppenheimer as undeniable proof that Robert must have turned Einstein against him. Throughout the film, Strauss appears almost exclusively in the objective black and white scenes. In the small amount of time that he appears in the subjective perspective of Oppenheimer, he is barely in the frame, oftentimes appearing out of focus, indicating that, contrary to Strauss's insistence that Oppenheimer was out to get him and turn everyone against him, the truth was that even when they interacted, Oppenheimer barely registered Strauss at all. He simply meant nothing to him. I found myself thinking of the HBO miniseries Chernobyl a lot during the film, which in my opinion is the best miniseries ever made. Not just how the two deal with the aftermath of man-made nuclear tragedies, but how they both deal with the search for accuracy and honesty, and how the truth is only relevant when it supports your narrative. One of the best scenes in the film is between Oppenheimer and President Harry Truman. Robert admits that he feels he has blood on his hands after the bombs were dropped in Japan. Truman tells him that the Japanese didn't care who created the bomb, they just care who dropped it. Which was Truman's truth in that moment. He was happy to take credit for dropping the bomb. Truman, just like the majority of Americans at the time, viewed the creation and dropping of the atomic bomb as patriotic, and didn't question its moral implications and the ramifications that would ripple into the world we live in now. From the second the bombs were taken from him at Los Alamos and out of his control, Oppenheimer knew that nothing would ever be the same. It wasn't until years later that the dominant voice would flip, and the rest of the world shared in that truth. Nolan has a lot to say about action and reaction here, both in the narrative and the structure of the film. Oppenheimer is literally broken up into two parts. Again, subjective and objective, but these parts are also labeled by the words fission for Oppenheimer and fusion for Strauss. Fission literally means to divide or split something into two parts. Fusion means the process of joining two things together to form a single entity. The decision to label these is a foreshadowing of how the story will be divided in order to be told, and how it will eventually merge to form a single cohesive narrative. The events of the fusion section are a direct result of everything that occurred in the fission section, thus cause and effect. Action and reaction, and specifically chain reactions, occur constantly throughout the film. Robert vindictively poisons his professor's apple. Overcome with guilt, Oppenheimer races to undo his mistake, which leads him to cross paths with Niels Bohr, which would steer Oppenheimer towards the inevitable creation of the nuclear bomb. Oppenheimer's decision to go to a communist party leads to his collision with Jean, which as a result, again, impacts the course of the rest of his life. However, the chain reaction which ultimately culminated with the atomic bomb began long before Oppenheimer, even before the discovery of the atom itself. That chain extends all the way back to the very moment when fire was first harnessed by man. Nolan's use of rain as a visual metaphor for inescapability was perfect. The first thing we see in the film is a young Oppenheimer transfixed by the rain creating ripples across a puddle, followed by a deafening, rhythmic rumbling and the first visions of fire, before Oppenheimer forces them away, opens his eyes, and begins his testimony. When describing his time at Cambridge, he is seen in bed, disturbed, the rain finding him again, this time as an endless stream pouring down his window. Hours before the Trinity test, there is a massive storm, a prelude to the test itself and the devastation it represents. At the end of the film, when we finally see the conversation between Oppenheimer and Einstein, Robert is again confronted with the ripples in the water. The rain has found him, yet again, just as inescapable as it was when he first encountered it decades earlier. Nolan then has the film end with Robert closing his eyes, just as he had the film begin with him opening them, forcing himself to push away the visions that have haunted him for as long as he can remember. I thought the ending of the film was devastatingly powerful. To discover that the danger, albeit remote, of pushing that button and starting a chain reaction that would destroy the world, in a way, actually happened, is a terrifying thought, and it's as relevant now as it was in 1945. That countdown never stopped, and that is truly frightening. So is this the best film of Christopher Nolan's career? The simple answer is no, it's not. But to be fair, over his 25-year career, Nolan has set the bar incredibly high. Overall, I thought Oppenheimer was powerful, very well acted, with a phenomenal score, incredible cinematography, and a fascinating thesis. I was compelled the majority of the film, and despite some questionable editing, muffled dialogue, and a middle third that could have used some work, I thought the ending was thought-provoking and devastating. And I give Oppenheimer an 8.5 out of 10. If you have the opportunity to see this one in 70mm IMAX, I would highly recommend it. Regardless, like every one of Christopher Nolan's films, see it on the biggest screen possible.